Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Walk and Talk Wednesday, where you all ask the questions, we go on a little walk, I do the talking, and then hopefully by the end of the trail, I've answered your question for you. My name is Father Chase. Let's dive into this week's question. So, where did sin come from? That is, where did it all get started? Who created sin? Did God create sin? Did Adam and Eve? Did Satan? Where did sin get its origin? Well, to get to an answer, there are two things we need to understand first. First, we need to understand the history of sin. And second, we need to understand the nature of sin. That is, what it is exactly we're talking about when we talk about sin. So let's start with the history. The Bible makes it very clear in both the Old and New Testament that God is responsible for all of creation. Everything that exists is because He created it. And it may lead us to think then that must mean that God is the one responsible for creating sin, right? Well, not so fast, because the scripture is also very clear that when God created everything, He did so perfectly, or without any sin being present. In Genesis chapter 1, we read that God, as He was creating, labeled everything good, which is a way of saying that it was free of sin. So no being, no creature, no human, no angelic being was created in the beginning with any presence of sin in their life. Sin is an after effect, something that happens after God is done creating everything. However, the Bible does make it clear that God created beings with the potential to sin, or the possibility of sinning. That is, He gave humans the ability to choose whether or not they would choose sin or choose God's standard of holiness. We also learn later in Scripture that God gave angelic beings the potential or freedom to choose whether or not they would sin or choose God's standard of holiness. So does this mean that sin was started by people, by Adam and Eve in the garden? Well, let's look at Genesis chapter 3, which is the story of the first sin. So in the garden, Adam and Eve are told not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We know that the serpent tempted Eve and then Adam and convinced them to eat the fruit. And then subsequently that resulted in their first sin, and sin then entering into all of creation. So we say Adam and Eve created sin, right? Again, not so quick. Because although that's the first recorded sin of humanity, and consequently the sin of all creation, it's actually not the first sin ever. And Genesis 3 gives us clues and hints that this is the case. The first clue is in the first three words of that chapter. Now the serpent. You see, in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God labels everything good, sinless, perfect. And the writer of Genesis chapter 3 wants to clue us in that something's changed from chapters 1 and 2. Something is different about this serpent. This serpent is ominous. This serpent has experienced something that nothing else in creation has experienced before. Well, we later find out in scriptures that that serpent is, in fact, the former angel Lucifer, or Satan. And we learn more about the details of what happened to Satan, or Lucifer, in the books of Isaiah and Ezekiel. And what those books tell us is that Lucifer was a supreme angelic being that was created sinless, perfect, created to glorify God, a beautiful creature. But then something happened, and suddenly Lucifer wasn't happy being below or beneath God, and wanted to be in the place of God. And that resulted in Lucifer's first sin, the first sin. Subsequently, God cast Lucifer out of heaven, and the next time we see him is in Genesis chapter 3, when he's taken on the form of a serpent to deceive God's most prized creation, Adam and Eve, humanity. So we see from the history of sin that sin, the first sin, was performed by Lucifer, by Satan. But now the question is, what caused Satan to sin? What tempted him? How did even the idea of sinning come into Lucifer's mind? Well, to answer that question, we need now to look at the nature of sin. So the Bible uses a lot of terms to characterize sin. It uses the word iniquity. It uses the term perversion, transgression. It uses the word trespass, lawlessness. But two words are probably the most common or popular terms that the Bible uses, and two that really summarize all the terms. The first of those is the word transgression. And we all know what a transgression is, right? It's an intentional, willful act of disobedience against a known law. That is, when we transgress, we're transgressing against a known law, and we're choosing to go against it. So in this case, we're going against God's law or God's standard of holiness. So it's a willful act, it's intentional. The second term is missing the mark. The Hebrew word is chata, and the Greek word is hamartano. Both of them are archery terms which mean missing the mark or missing the way. It's used when an archer is aiming at a bullseye but misses his mark. They hamartano or they chata. It's a way of saying someone has missed the mark of God's holiness. They've missed the mark of perfection. They've gotten off the path. Now, what's implied about these terms is that it's not necessarily intentional. When we think of an archer, we think of him or her aiming his bow and arrow towards something, but missing. But that miss is not necessarily an intentional miss, it's an accidental miss. I don't know too many archers that aim towards a bullseye and intentionally miss. It's usually unintentional. And so a sin doesn't necessarily have to be intentional. It can be an unintentional sin. And that might cause us to say, well, wait a second, so God will hold us accountable for things that we don't intentionally do? Absolutely. And we do the same, right? Think of it like this. Think if you're driving down the highway and the posted speed limit is 55, but then suddenly the speed reduces to 35, but you didn't see the posted speed limit reduced, and you get pulled over by a cop. Now you can honestly tell the police officer you had no clue that the speed limit had changed and that you were going what you thought was the posted speed limit. But the cop may still decide to write you a citation because in actuality, you broke the law. We all broke the law if we go over the speed limit, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And the cop is in his right to do so because we still broke the law. And the chances are you're actually going to get a ticket for going 20 miles over the speed limit. The point is, sin can be both intentional and unintentional acts of disobedience towards God's standard of holiness. So now, what does this tell us about the origin of sin? Well, the thing I want us to realize is that sin is not necessarily an entity in and of itself. It's not some sort of created thing, right? Sin is an act of perversion, an act of disobedience. It's an after effect of God's good creation. It's the absence of God's goodness in the world. Think of it like this. Right now, I have light because there's a sun shining on me and it's illuminating everything around me. But now if I wanted to create darkness, what would I need? Well, I wouldn't need something. I would just need to block the sun, right? Or get rid of the sun. So, I might put up some shade, some umbrellas or something like that. But there's not an object, not a created thing, something in itself that exists that creates darkness. Darkness is simply the absence of light. So if we want to get rid of the light from the sun, we just simply need to block the light or remove the sun. Well, that's kind of like God's goodness and sin. Sin is simply the absence of God's goodness. It's not an entity in and of itself. It's not a thing that exists. It's simply the absence or perversion of God's holiness. And so what this tells us is that somewhere in heaven, sin wasn't something that was created by God. It was that somehow Lucifer blocked God's goodness in his heart. And in that shadow, sin was able to enter in. And that was when he was able to commit the first act of sin, of rebellion against God. We don't know if it was intentional or unintentional, though it seems very much from the text that it was an intentional act and an intentional decision. But it wasn't necessarily created by God. It was simply Lucifer who blocked God's goodness from his life. And the same is true for us. Sin is not something that creeps into our lives as much as it's us choosing to block God's goodness from our lives. And when we block God's holiness and we block God's goodness, the darkness creeps in. Sin fills what was once filled by light. So the origin of sin was started with Lucifer by him blocking God's goodness or holiness from his life. Well, that answers this week's question. We are at the end of the trail. If you have any other questions or comments, please make them down below. I'd be glad to try to keep dialoguing. And if you have a suggested question, please go ahead and submit those to me. I'd love to hear from you. Well, this is Father Chase. We'll see you next week. Take care.